how many of these have you been to?
5.
Even to all of them?
Yeah, that's right. Every single one, and of course a lot of it is my wife Linda really loves coming to, so I couldn't possibly miss any. Yeah.
So what do you get out of them?
Oh yeah, well, it's very enjoyable. It's a very lovely place. There are lots of interesting people here, lots of interesting talks and excursions, and it's a beautiful city.
One thing that many of the laureates have said to me is that they love getting together with the laureates, although one of the main drives of the HLF is mentorship.
Yes, no, it's true that I do get to talk to the young researchers here, and that's interesting. I enjoy meeting them.
Well, tell me about that. Sort of, what do you think they get from you?
It's interesting that they want to know about how I came across NP completeness, which is what I'm famous for, of course. And so I'm happy to tell them that. I mean, that it came out of my logic background, that where we talked about recursively numerable sets, and so the main idea was there, that you can have the notion of a complete problem, and so there was NP completeness.
And how old were you when you developed this?
This paper was 1971, and I was born, well, so it had been 31, I guess. I was 31 years old.
So not much older than the researchers here.
That's right. That's true. I had already gotten my PhD it was about 4 years later. Of course, those 4 years were spent at UC Berkeley, and the math department didn't deny me tenure, and so I looked around and got a very nice job offer. Oh, there's the man.
Yeah, he's coming in he's doing the...
I'll be here in a few minutes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sorry.
Well, yes, I was just talking about being denied tenure at Berkeley, and a certain individual who's right here, Abel Prize.
Oh, I remember that well.
I think may have had something to do with my getting a job at
We struggled to get him.
Should I turn this to you?
We tried. First, the math department said, "No, you're too late."
Would you like to come up and actually we could
If you want.
Yeah, sure, why not? So once again, if you would start that story again.
Okay. So yes, my first position after my PhD was the University of California at Berkeley in the mathematics department, or it's actually half-time in mathematics and half-time in the computer, wasn't the department,
Computing center.
Center. It was a research thing. There was a budding computer science department, but at that point, when I was hired, I wasn't part of that. And so eventually, after I came up the tenure, and the mathematics department denied me of tenure, and so I had to find another place, and the computer science department there at Berkeley didn't seem to want me either, saying, well, we can't take somebody who's been denied tenure.
No, that's not what happened.
Oh, so what, do you want to give your side of the story? Or?
Well, I arrived in Berkeley in January of 1969 because I had been asked by one of my friends there to help form a new computer science department. I actually had a position in the new computer science department and in math, and also in the computing center.
No, 3.
Okay. which was a clandestine computer science department. One of the directors of the computing center before my time had promised a number of people that if they worked in the computing center, then when a computer science department would be formed, they could move the jobs over to that. Except that he did not have the power to make good on his promise. Is there something?
It just came up.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
He didn't have the power.
I don't think I was told that, actually, for me. Anyway.
It may have been implicit, it's hard to say.
I see.
But I do know that others, like Bob Baer and one or two others, were very much of the opinion that they could expect to join the computer science department when it was formed in the School of Letters and Science.
So if I could back up for a second, so you were a professor there, a tenured professor at Berkeley?
Oh, yes.
And you were
Yes.
Trying to get
Assistant
tenure.
professor.
That's
An
right.
assistant professor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had sort of 50% in math, 50% in the new computer science, and 50% in the computing center. And if that adds up to more than 100%, well, so be it. My first lectures were in math. I also lectured in computer science, but at that time my office was in the same building as the math department. And I had a habit of walking the halls in the late afternoon and early evening as I was thinking about various things. And I would pass his office, and I would hear how he was treating students. And I came to the conclusion that I should visit the chairman at that time, that was Addison, and told him, you know, you have a gem.
That's the math chairman.
Yeah, in the chairman of the math department was Addison. And I said, you have a gem here, but he doesn't blow his own horn. But I've heard what he says and how he says it. And we really should keep this guy. And Addison said, well, it's too bad you weren't here last September, because that's when we decided not to give him tenure. So I went to my other department, the new computer science department, and said, something really bad is going to happen. The campus is going to lose this guy. And my colleagues said, yes, you're right, this guy's done some remarkable work. The fact that other members of the math department don't know what to make of it is their fault, not his. And so we tried to go to the then Dean of Letters and Science and say, we need a position for this guy or we're going to lose him. And the Dean of Letters and Science said something akin to what you thought. He said, the budget committee, it's not the math department, the budget committee is not going to grant this guy a tenured position, or a promotion, in effect, to tenure, if so prestigious a department as mathematics has denied him tenure. And we could protest till we were blue in the face, but it didn't do any good. So I phoned the chairman of the computer science department at the University of Toronto, which is what I had just left. And he was an old friend, Tom Hull. And I said, Tom, we're about to make a terrible mistake from which you can profit. And the rest, I think, you've heard.
Well, I was starting to hear.
Well, starting here, maybe.
What was your experience of this?
So I was, what I remember is I was job hunting because I had to find a place, and I was on the East Coast and interviewing at, Princeton and other nice places, and then I got a phone call, and it was from Tom Hall, and Tom had called my wife and to find out found out where I was, and so Tom asked if I could interview there, and I said, yeah, eventually. not that particular trip. But anyway, that's how it got arranged.
So when you were at Berkeley, how much did you two interact?
Hardly at all.
Yeah.
The work he did was in a field quite different from mine. I was a numerical analyst, an error analyst in the world of continua. And he's working in what you could call discrete math on some rather important problems. But other members of the math department didn't appreciate the importance of those problems, but more than that, they didn't appreciate the guy's talent, particularly his talent for dealing with students, which I eavesdropped on. And these two things seemed to me, well, I was outraged that the math department was going to lose him, and that the campus was going to lose him because we couldn't get him a position in computer science. And so I called up Tom Hall.
And Tom was a very good recruiter. He was very polished and showed me around Toronto and pointed out that there is a lake there, and I had actually learned to sail at Berkeley, and that was a feature. So yes, that part was okay, and the department was up and coming, and so I brought Linda along. She was invited.
I mean, it was a department at Toronto that I'd helped form. I'd started as a student there, and I was supposed to teach numerical analysis, except two of the guys I was going to work with, one of them died in August just before I arrived in 1960, back from 2 years in Cambridge, and the other one died in November. And there I was teaching numerical analysis, the only one, and teaching a fairly demanding course. We'll talk about that later. And so we recruited Tom Hall from the University of Vancouver, University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And technically he would be my superior because he was a full professor and I was just an assistant professor at the time. When he was recruited, that was 1964. And he and I got along very well, as long as I understood that I might have to educate him about some things. But he was a very polished guy. He used to, whenever he lectured, things used to come out in straight lines, which is a special talent. And so we got along well, and that's why I think he trusted me when I told him that he could profit from Berkeley's mistake.
If I can move from, first of all, I think this is valuable history, and I feel very lucky that you just happened to come along. Would you like me to take that?
No, it's okay. We'll be happy.
I feel very lucky that you just happened to come along, but if you don't mind, since I am doing this for HLF and a lot of the things are about mentorship and relationships and so on, you raised an interesting question. You said that you recognized his talent. Mm-hmm. How do you recognize, I'll ask this of both of you, I suppose start with you, Dr. Cook. Well, how do you recognize talent?
I don't know. I did have one PhD student who was successful while I was at Berkeley. And so he, actually, his theorem became famous. You know what? I'm losing my memory, so I'm trying to remember his theorem. But in any case, that was my big success there.
Who is this? Oh, you really do lose your memory at our age when names drop into these pits.
Yeah.
And they climb out after half an hour when the interview is over.
But did you recognize him as a talent before he made it big, do you think? Or?
Well, yeah, he was a reasonably talented guy, and he came in with this really nice idea, and so we talked about it, and he turned that and other things into a very nice thesis. And he also, by the way, crewed for me when I was sailing races in the harbor.
And I'd like to ask you the same question, but first, when you come across a talent like that, how do you nurture it?
I don't know. I just talk to them, and I don't know there's any special theory. We talk about what he might think about. He had this idea, and I said, oh, that's really nice, and we talked about it and worked on it. I don't have any magical ideas of what to do.
Well, I got an award for mentoring at Berkeley. I'm not sure I deserved it, but I think my most important consideration was not to disappoint my wife, who had a degree in philosophy and social work. And if I had not paid attention to students, but simply worked on my own mathematics, then I think she would have been dismayed. And so I did get into the habit of listening to students. And I can't describe exactly how mentoring works because each student is different. And we want to cultivate certain of those differences that make for an original mind. If you recognize an original and fertile mind, and there are lots of ways to do that, but you have to be looking for them, well then it's our duty as professors to help to cultivate that, because the cost of a college education is horrendous. And it doesn't get repaid unless we cultivate the intellectual leadership in various directions. Not all in the same direction, you see. It's rather that you find a student whose mind is special of its kind and worthwhile, and then try to find a way to help that student flourish. And I know this is not an algorithm, which is what you might have preferred, but it's the best I can do for describing what to do. You recognize talent in many different styles, many different ways. And one should be, as a professor, we have to be sensitive to the variety of ways in which intellect can excel in worthwhile ways. Not just figuring out how to bet on horses or perhaps just how to collect theorems. A large number of the theorems we teach to undergraduates have at best archival value, especially in some courses like algebra. What's more important is that we communicate with theorems or other things why it is that the structures we're talking about are like physics. The world is that way because it can be no other. And we would like students to be able to understand that. And that requires more than mechanical proofs. It's more than a game with axioms. And in the course of presenting that kind of material, we vary the presentation sufficiently that some students will respond to this bit and some students respond to that bit, and you look at the work that they hand in or you listen to the questions they ask in class and you begin to recognize that here is something special.
Were there for each of you, and you can take this in whatever order you like, I don't think I had quite gotten to that question with you before you came in, who were your mentors? But were there people who recognized that in you?
Oh yeah.
Yes, well, my advisor was Hao Wang when I was at Harvard. He was a logician, and he certainly was very helpful. I mean, he was also interested in computers. He had worked for IBM for a while and was programming computers to solve propositional tautologies, and which is logic. He was a logician, so I got interested in logic, and that certainly had an influence on what I did before.
Was there a particular way that he was able to draw out your particular qualities?
I can't analyze that kind of thing. I don't know what to think. By the way, I have had, I think it's 34 PhD, supervised or co-supervised, 34 PhD people in my career. So I do seem to get along with people well enough. And Walter Savage, that's the guy who was the Berkeley guy, was my first PhD. And the theorem is that, one way of saying, non-deterministic log space is a subset of deterministic log square space. That's anyway, it's one way of saying the theorem. And that caught on. That is now known as Savage's theorem, and it's in the main textbooks on the subject.
So, as for your mentors, Dr.
Well, I'm very decidedly not a self-made man. I benefited from the high school that we went to in Toronto, that my brother and I went to, and then benefited from most of the professors and students at Toronto. You see, we sometimes learn more from our fellow students than we learn from this or that professor. But there were some professors who were just outstanding. You'll remember one, Kelly Gottlieb, who in some sense was my hero because he was the one who helped get me into the summer programming program in 1953, which is where I learned about programming computers. 1953.
That's a long time ago.
What university? Where was that?
At the University of Toronto.
At Toronto.
Yes, the University of Toronto had a computer which had arrived there, I think, in 48 or 49, in order to help with the movement of earth excavated for the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then it was being used also for calculating something to do with the construction of highway bridges in the province of Ontario. And I knew that the computer and I were meant for each other because my hobby was electronics. I understood just how the computer had worked. In fact, the way Gottlieb and I got introduced to one another was that somebody else, but I can't remember who, told me in March of 1953, there's a computer in that building. And I asked what a computer was, and he told me it computes things according to a list of instructions that it will execute at your behest. And I asked myself, how would you ever build a thing to do that? And so I imagined building one out of telephone relays. And it was not intended to be built because it would have consumed all the power output from Niagara Falls. But once I had the idea, this is how it could be done, I walked into Kelly Gottlieb's office. He was the de facto director of the computing center. And I said, well, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. And our relationship flourished from there. But I had other professors who were influential. One, H.S.M. Coxeter. He was a geometer. You might say he was the best 19th century geometer still alive in the 20th century. And what he did was so beautiful and so elegant that although I had no intention of becoming a geometer like him, I wanted to take his classes just so something of him would rub off on me. And there were one or two others who were not quite so influential. One was a physicist. His name was Barnes. Now, Barnes had the reputation of being the laziest man on campus until I turned up. And he and I got along extremely well. He taught statistical mechanics, and I took a course on statistical mechanics from him. My thesis advisor knew nothing about my thesis. He was essentially a statistician who had also participated in writing a book on mathematical mechanics. Singh and Griffith. This was Byron A. Griffith was the thesis advisor. But he was an extraordinarily patient and decent man whom I came to revere. So yes, there were people who helped make me what I am today. But Gottlieb was one of the dominant influences.
I had professors as an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and when I went there, I joined the engineering department because, well, the earlier mentor was somebody from my hometown, Wilson Greatbatch, who invented the artificial pacemaker, and so I worked with him, and I was going to be an engineer. And that's how I started out. But then I took a math course and from Kazarinov, and he got me very interested in mathematics, and eventually, so I switched to a math major.
If I can move forward a little bit, since this is HLF. You know, I don't have a specific question really, but I guess the theme is about the sort of information that goes to the young researchers today. I suppose if I were to frame it as a question, how is what they're facing different from what you faced in your time?
Say again?
How is what they're facing now different?
So what students face now?
Yeah, like the researchers here.
Oh, well, in my case, I was extremely lucky because the field was new. Computational complexity had just been invented. So there were all these results ready to be found out, including NP completeness. And I think people, a lot more sophisticated people in the field now, and a great deal is known. So I'm not sure that that things are as easy for the younger generation.
You had a green field, so to speak.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion about between now and then?
It's impossible for me adequately to compare the situation facing students today compared with what it was like then, because, as in his case, I got in on the ground floor. You see, my hobby had been electronics, starting from age 11 or 12. And so I understood a lot about vacuum tubes, a good deal about the digital and pulse circuits. In fact, I had a part-time job throughout 1954, 54, repairing equipment for the physics department. I would repair oscilloscopes and war surplus pulse generators to be used by graduate students, and the moving coil meters. My eyes and my hand were good enough that I could repair many of those. And of course, some of these had been burnt out by my contemporaries in their physics labs. And yet, for funny reasons we can go into some other time, I had chosen to major in mathematics, and the combination of mathematics and electronics and a hankering for physics made my career choice obvious, because I perceived the electronic computer as a physical device whose behavior submitted to mathematical analysis, or so I thought. Well, it only had 256 words of memory, so instead of 256 gigabytes of memory. And so the thought that its behavior could be predicted by mathematical reasoning, the same as you'd predict the behavior of the simpler physical systems like the solar system, even including relativity, that was just impossible to resist. And well, we got married in the autumn of 1954, just as I became a graduate student, and my wife knew that my previously stated expectation of becoming a high school math teacher was simply not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Something else was going to happen.
How did she feel about that?
How did she feel about it?
Yeah.
Well, she had been skeptical to begin with that I would end up as a high school math teacher, which is what I had promised her. And so she ended up, after she got her degree, working to help support us while I finished my thesis. And indeed, in the late spring of 1958, she typed my thesis. We had to buy a typewriter for the purpose. I remember Griffith telling me, "Kahn, write your thesis." This was in March, I think, of 1958. He said, "Kahn, write a thesis. I don't care which of the 10 theses you could write that you do write. Write a thesis and hand it in by May or find another thesis advisor." Okay, so that's what I did.
I'm sorry, who was this, Kahn?
This was Griffith, Griffith, who had been my thesis advisor. Now, I think he had a good reason to put forward that deadline, because he had suffered throat cancer. And so he had to speak through a hole in his throat, sort of a burping thing. And he expected to retire shortly after he finished me. And I would have been his last PhD student, except the guy who would have been second last dragged on somewhat. So I was his second last PhD student. Come to think of it, I remember now that after I had passed the last exam for the PhD, I made a Go board for him. He liked to play Go. And the trouble with the Go board was that it opens with hinges, and although it lies flat on the table, the hinges will scratch the table. So what I did was to replace the hinges by the invisible hinges, disappearing hinges. They're hinges that fold very cleverly into themselves, and then put felt on the bottom of the board, and that was my gift and appreciation for the work he had done. And I still have the prototype, because I built two, one to practice on, and then when I was satisfied I'd gotten it right, I built the final one for him. Well, as I said, I revered him. I thought I owed him a great deal because he listened to me. And he taught me that a graduate student's duty is to educate his professor. And I've followed that subsequently.
Well, I certainly learned from my students, I have to say.
I'm going to let that be a segue back to the HLF, because of course you're surrounded here by students. Have you, now how many years have you been coming?
Let's see. When was the first one?
5 years ago. It would have been 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, so it would have been 13. I missed 2015 because I was in the hospital, but I came to all the others. The reason for coming, despite the inconvenience of travel, is to hear what weighs on students' minds now. You asked before about
How are things different? Well, at lunch today, I was speaking with a student from Armenia who has a job in London as a math teacher, but he thinks of himself, and his degree is in theoretical physics. But he can't find a job as a theoretical physicist, despite that he has a gold medal from the Math Olympiad that is held in Europe annually. So he can't be stupid. And he has a wife and 2 babies to support, and unable to get a job except as a math lecturer bothers him because he can't do what he thought he really wants to do. And we had a conversation, and I tried to encourage him to think about other arenas where the background as a theoretical physicist will be extremely valuable. For example, as a quant in financial houses and hedge funds, but also in the computerization of life sciences, because what theoretical physicists learn that most others do not is how to create models that are mathematically tractable. And that's definitely in demand in lots of areas. So I wanted to encourage him to think more broadly, not merely as a theoretical physicist. But you know, when you get into a conversation with a student, it's hard to predict where it will go. And the relationship can be somewhat avuncular. So I'm like an uncle or a great uncle or something like that, trying to help a student to cultivate ideas about what they might do. Sometimes it's for the research, and sometimes it's for personal things. It's difficult to predict what will come up.
Now I looked at my clock, and I see that actually it's almost time for Dr. Efros. Mm-hmm. So this has been an unexpected pleasure to do this with both of you right now. Any final thoughts possibly about the HLF, or well, let's say about the HLF, since that is who will be using these?
Well, certainly an enjoyable place to be, and I intend to keep coming along, and my wife also enjoys it a great deal, so actually I couldn't ever stay home.
Yes, my wife is a tourist in the family, and so she enjoys the opportunities to go around and look at places. We're going to miss the scheduled visit to Frankfurt because we'll be on our way back home. We have to get home in time for Yom Kippur. But I guess the story that might interest your people is a story about career choices. You see, I've always known exactly what I was going to do. But I've been right several times and wrong more often. And so, for example, I had not decided whether to major in physics or in mathematics until one Friday afternoon in the late spring of 1953. I was accosted by the physics professor who was in charge of the optics lab. And we were taking optics at that time, and he said, "Kahan, you've been very good at this stuff." The reason he said that was because my lab partner was a pal from high school, and both of us were handy with tools, and our first task was not to run the experiment according to the sheet handed out to us, but first to repair the equipment. You see? Then after we repair the equipment, we recalibrate it. Then we run the experiment. Needless to say, our results come out rather better than most other students. So, of course, we stood out. My friend ultimately got his PhD in physics at Brookhaven in New York. But meanwhile, this professor said, Kahan, you really should become a physicist. You know, all the world's greatest scientists have been physicists. And as he said that, the name Pasteur crossed my mind. He wasn't a physicist. Darwin wasn't a physicist. And so I got a whiff of his breath, and that made the decision for me. I said, if being drunk on 3:30 on Friday afternoon is what it means to be a physicist, I want none of it, and I chose math. So this is how we make these important decisions, you see.
I can't think of a better end.